Hi, this is Bomani for the Sprint 4 Sprint video. This sprint we focused on redesigning some interfaces to help students with the uh, generation and evaluation of alternative plans. In our last round of testing, we found that it was pretty difficult for students to really generate um, different ways of completing stories at different levels of fidelity. And so we hope that with these interfaces that we tested with students, that it would help them to do this process more effectively. We started by thinking about the planning process, and we considered the planning process to have four different levels. It begins at the sprint level. The next level down are stories. After that, we have what we call task groups, and then underneath we have tasks. And we find that students oftentimes write task groups as stories, um, or consider task groups as stories, and it's kind of difficult when we have to build interfaces that ask students to enter in stories when there's this sort of ambiguity around what a story actually is. And so what we realized is that we really want to understand kind of how students are thinking about the planning process, and we claimed that students are really only able to think about slices or plans two levels down from where they start. So if you're thinking about it, the sprint level, the most detailed that you can really start to sort of think about and generate alternatives around would be at the task group level. So going from sprint to story to task group, so two levels down from the sprint level where you're starting to consider. And similarly, if you start at the story level, you could kind of consider detailed tasks in the process of considering different plans. Um, so we thought about that a lot, and we think that was really interesting to add to our sort of claims document, which kind of leads me into the claims document that we wanted to write. So we found that there was some sort of there was a little bit of spread in the way that the SIG was thinking about the work that we were doing, and we found it hard to kind of align on a direction. And so we wanted to help ourselves by actually just making a document to send out to our mentors about the different things that we've been designing and working on, specifically the needs and the design arguments or claims that we have for our interfaces. So we listed out all of the needs, and then we also wrote um, uh, claims to go along. And as you can see, the needs here are broken down into needs for teams, SIGs, and for mentors. And the claims specifically reference some of the different needs here. And so the claim that I was just talking about is one of the claims that we have listed here that kind of talks about the depth of consideration that students can have around generating and evaluating alternative slices. But continuing onward, we wanted to actually build out these two interfaces that we had, one called Fidelitys and one called Playgrounds, and then start to test those with users. So the first one I'll show here is the Playgrounds one. Basically, this interface allows students to sort of enter in tasks into what you can consider like a task bank, and then drag out different alternatives for how they can complete the story that they have listed here in the top entry box. So as you can see, this user starts off with a story that includes like all of the different tasks they listed, but they might have a story that only includes two and or three, and maybe so on and so forth. And each one of these individual columns here yields a deliverable that should be able to complete the story. We found that with this interface, it was pretty difficult to help people to actually understand what the point of the interface was and how it worked. There was a lot of like teaching required to get students on board with this, and we felt like this afforded students generating an array of options that generally range from like low fidelity to high fidelity, but we didn't necessarily include anything here that would help students to really understand how to link the story back to a claim to make sure that it's delivering value as well. So that was kind of a missing piece of this interface, and it did need that. We do need that part to kind of make sure that the full stack of planning is being accomplished and supported. The other interface we tested was the Fidelitys interface. So this one is pretty similar to the JARS one from before, but this time we specifically asked students to generate a low, medium, and high fidelity option for completing their story that they've listed here. So as you can see with this user, they essentially list out these three options, and then they use this interactive chart here to drag out and sort of decide on which ones have the most realistic value and also deliver the most value to their research. So what we learned from this was that just having clearly labeled options for Fidelities actually did help students to generate concepts for alternative plans that were a little bit more focused and directed. Um, but we also realized that students were not necessarily always able to understand that the highest fidelity option isn't always necessarily the most value delivering. There's this sort of like implication that, any list of deliverables that span from low, medium, and to high should kind of take on this linear format where the low option is the most realistic but delivers the least value, and the highest option is the least realistic, essentially the most difficult, but is the most useful. And we don't think that that's always the case. In a lot of cases, there might be a 1 hour task that you could do that would deliver them the same amount of research value as a 4 hour task that you could do. And so we think that the evaluation step in this interface helped there, but once again, like, this doesn't necessarily connect back to the higher level research direction as much, and so it makes it a little bit more difficult to determine if the stories that the students are writing actually even accomplish things that would be value delivering to their research. So neither of these interfaces really motivated students. The students didn't feel like they were taking away a lot of value from the interfaces. A lot of people were saying that it was kind of cool to do in retrospect, but that the things that they were learning through the interface were also sort of intuitive and natural to them. And so, after considering these things and considering this big question of motivation that we've been running into a lot throughout the designs, we wanted to take a step back and sort of consider, a whole new way of how we might be able to help students through the planning process. So to do that, we started by really just trying to consider how students naturally plan. Think about like the things that students normally do, and have told us on multiple occasions that they do when they begin to write a sprint plan. So many students and many teams tell us that they just list out a bunch of to-dos and then think about those and prioritize those and then change those into stories. And so we wanted to see if we could design something that would fit nicely into that framework, which led us to this sort of Google Drive interface. So the prototype that we created here is really a process that allows students to kind of go through the entire plan creation um, process in only 18 minutes. So essentially, you can go from having nothing to having something for a sprint in 18 minutes, which we think is cool, but we also would like to look into as far as like lowering or making that more making that time period more focused. So to explain the interface here, we have a clock. This timer kind of times the different phases of the process. We feel that having a timer can kind of help people to either generate more or to kind of like close things out before they sort of trail off too long. We want students to really like focus on like making plans and then getting on to doing work so that they can feel that their research is progressing and not get as fed up as they usually tend to with the entire planning process. So to detail some of the steps in this process, I can pull up the testing plan here. So the process starts with a 3-minute listing of to-dos. During this process, like, the interface will ask if there's anything they're forgetting towards the end, and the questions for the ask come up in the let me pull that up here. So come up in the chat window here. So this is a fake bot chat that we have, which is really just a conversation between me and Samir, where questions are being asked. And so students go through, they list their to-dos. After they're done listing to their to-dos, they pick the value delivering ones for the constrained time period. They also fill in the details of each to do. So that process would basically look like, going through, writing in all of the, sort of sub bullet points that you might want to include for a task. So you can see here, user test with 10 users actually includes like scheduling with users, getting them to actually test, following them around, and so on and so forth. Afterwards, you rank them with high, medium, or low for all of the sort of top level and sub level listings, and then you evaluate time. So you add a point value to each thing that you listed there. And a lot of times, what we notice is that students will come out to a number that's actually higher than the amount of time that they have to work, which is very natural and sort of normal. And so then the last phase is slicing and reducing the plan. So determining which things that you wrote you actually want to do. And we find that during this phase, even though we don't ask students to explicitly list out all of the different alternatives they consider, they actually go through a pretty high volume of different alternatives based off of like changing point values for certain tasks, removing certain tasks, adding certain tasks even. And we thought that that generation and evaluation process in this planning framework was pretty helpful and pretty cool. Some of the things that we would like to do in the future would be to consider more about how to actually help students connect the work that they're doing back to design arguments. But we tested this with 2 users, and we found that the planning seemed pretty natural, especially the listing of to-dos phase in step 1. The way that people list their to-dos kind of tend to vary. This specific user generated a lot, but another person that we tested with generated really few to-dos and then only had a few at the beginning, and then over the planning process realized that they kind of needed to add more and more detail in, which made it a little bit more difficult for them to understand. So the interface doesn't necessarily afford like doesn't impose any planning or sort of expectations for how you would write out the plans, and because of that it may lead to some confusion about like how to complete some of the different phases. But yeah, that's our sprint for output. Thank you.